Welcome to episode 2 of Ty's Training, Talking with My Dad. I'm Tyler Andrews, and I'm joined by my co-host and father, Tim Andrews, as we dive into my first week of training for Project Himalaya. If you missed our introductory episode, I'd recommend go give that a listen first, as right today we are just going to dive right into it. Mr. C, good morning. How's it going over there?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to finally dive into the actual training stuff. So,
Yeah,
um,
me
yeah,
too.
before we actually do that, I wanted to go ahead and share with the audience a little bit of kind of sneak peek as to what the actual written part will look like, so you all can understand kind of what we're going to talk about and then how that will compare to the written version. And then also maybe that'll bring up a couple of, you know, questions on vocab, linguistics, that stuff. And then we will actually dive into this week. And then next week, hopefully everything will look totally normal to everybody. So I'm actually just going to go ahead on this recording and share my screen really quick. And we'll just do a quick tour of Substack, which is a new program for me. So this is our very first week that we're going to talk through here. And if you're on audio, I will just explain. Basically, we start out with what I call the warm-up section. The warm-up is 2 or 3 paragraphs where I kind of summarize the week. And then there is a table, and the table is kind of the easiest way to consume what I did that week. It's basically just, Monday through Sunday. You've got AM, PM, and XT. XT is my cross training. And so that's just kind of what I did in the morning, what I did in the afternoon. And then if there's anything else, strength training, other kinds of cross training. And then it has my totals at the bottom. And then it's literally just my entire running log is pasted, and we've thrown in some cool pictures. There's a really nice picture of a
Wow,
fox I took in
that's
Cotopaxi
a
National
cool
Park.
fox.
He's a nice
Yeah.
fox, huh? That was a good one. This camera's really sweet. So yeah, then there's just pictures, writing, and then at the end we will have our cool down section, which is usually going to be the same as what we talk about here on the podcast. It'll just be kind of a short written recap of that conversation, whereas the conversation part will be a lot more in depth. So this is Substack. Again, I'm super new to it, so if y'all have suggestions for how we can use it better, please feel free to send those in, and you can subscribe and get this in your email inbox once a week. So that's our quick tour of the written version. So now let's just dive into it. I know, Mr. C, you had a whole bunch of questions for this week to kind of drive our conversation. So yeah, let's just get into it.
Yeah. So, first question is, you opened this, I think, by talking about the fact that you were still on vacation and your inner golden retriever had to be let out or something like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so why did you start on vacation? And why start in cold Concord as opposed to warm and high altitude Ecuador?
Good question. So I think that when I think about a block or a season, a big chunk of time preparing for a new goal, I try to schedule some off season in between those. So this is kind of the transitionary period from true, vacation where I'm doing almost nothing from a training perspective. I'm not thinking about training to, okay, I'm kind of starting to think a little bit about training and doing some more active stuff. But it's more fun, active stuff. It's active stuff with friends. It's less structured. And then that kind of helps me get excited about exercise again and also just enjoying being fit and being able to do fun stuff with my friends in cool places. So that's kind of like the inner golden retriever thing, I think, is the ability to go out and on a whim say, hey, let's go to Cotopaxi National Park. Let's go to, wherever and just do some fun stuff and not worry about, oh, is this the right training stimulus? Is this too much? Is this too little? It just have fun with my friends in beautiful places. So that's kind of where we're starting. This is kind of going from super laid back and not really thinking about anything structurally in terms of training to, eventually over the next couple of weeks, getting more dialed on the training front. And then in terms of location, yeah, I was, home with you guys for the holidays and seeing friends and other family there, which is awesome. And then eventually relocating down here to Quito, Ecuador, which has really become kind of my high altitude home base over the last many, many years. And at some point we'll do a whole bonus segment on, why Quito and why it's so special and why I love it so much. But yeah, this will be my home base here for the Project Himalaya, most of the training block, literally until I go to the Himalaya. So I'll be here for about 3 months. And yeah, it's high altitude, it's great weather, it's quite close to the United States, and I have a really amazing community here of friends and athletes and all that good stuff. So that's why I'm here.
Okay. And you did talked about your last run before you left for Ecuador with your friend Connor. So how was that run? And tell us a little bit about your relationship with Connor and wrapping up your time in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Connor is one of my best friends. Also, coincidentally, lives in Massachusetts near you guys, which is great because I get to see him every time that I go home to visit y'all. And also, he's a runner. We actually met through coaching through Chosky. He basically just signed up as a Chosky athlete. He was one of our very first athletes in must have been like early 2020. And now over the years, we've kind of gone from the coach athlete relationship to he kind of started coming on some of our first trips with Chosky. And, we talked every week for like a year before we even met each other just as coach athlete and developed this really close relationship that way. And then, kind of popped the friendship seal at some point was I think his phrase. We went from being, coach athlete, kind of a client relationship to just best friends. And now, yeah, he's someone that I try to see whenever I'm back in Massachusetts and also like try to rope into a lot of dumb adventures to do with me. So he's actually coming down here to Quito at some point next month with his wife. They're super awesome. And he has a
Nice.
job that allows him some flexibility so he can, come just hang out in Quito for a month and work remotely and we can do some training together. And he's a great guy. He's the guy that I call when I have issues when I don't call you guys. So
Yeah, he's
yeah,
terrific. We love
he's a
Connor.
good guy. Yeah, we love Connor. Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was a
Great.
great run. It's always nice to kind of do stuff in my hometown where I grew up and kind of started running. There is definitely something special about, running on the trails around Walden Pond and even now still exploring and finding new little trails in Concord because, now I feel like I'm more of a trail runner than a road runner. But yeah, it brings back a lot of good memories and it's fun to do it with people who are special.
Great. When I read through your training logs, and this one as an example, the you use a lot of shorthand terms for places,
Hmm.
and so I think I made the comment geographically confused a lot. So can you tell us at least from the Quito perspective about some of these places, the main ones, and how they relate to your running in the city itself?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll keep using all these terms, so hopefully people will become more familiar with them over the week or over the coming weeks and months. So Quito's the capital of Ecuador. Ecuador is a little tiny country at the top of South America. And maybe I'll put a map or something on the written version as well if y'all want to check that out. But I would say the most
And
important,
Ecuador
yeah,
is named because Ecuador, I assume, is
is
Spanish for equator.
yeah, it's literally on the equator. So Quito is like 20 miles from the line of the equator. So fun
Yep.
fact, the mountain called Cayambe, which I can actually see from my house, is the highest point on Earth where the actual line of the equator passes through this mountain. It's
Oh, wow.
yeah, so you can see the line of the equator from the city because you can see Cayambe. And yeah, it's the only place on Earth where you can ski across the equator line. Fun fact.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
cool.
it's
Yeah,
pretty
you don't
crazy.
think
Yeah.
about skiing when you think of the equator.
Yeah. So that's Ecuador. Zooming in, we have Quito, which is right in the middle of the country. We're located in a really steep mountain valley. The city itself, we're at about 2,800 to 2,900 meters, so about 9 to 9,500 feet. Um, and then we have mountains. Oops, sorry, I hit my microphone. And then we have mountains on both sides that go up to about 4,700 meters, about 16,000 feet, right out of the city. So, I live in Quito in the city right on the edge. I live near a big park called the Parque Metropolitano. So I talk about the metro a lot, which is not the subway, though we do now have a subway in Quito, but it's the
Yes.
Metropolitan Park
Was
essentially.
confusing, right?
Yeah.
For those of us
And
who live in cities and have metro, which usually
yeah.
means the subway, right?
So yeah, I say the metro, and I'm talking about the park here, which is this giant,
Okay.
it's huge forest full of trails, amazing. And in there are two things that I've mentioned a lot. One is called the
So
penitente.
when you say park,
Yep,
this particular park is a forest park, not just
yep.
like a little park with trails that people walk their kids
No,
on.
I mean, they do that, but it's huge forest. I mean, there are big open spots in it, but it's mostly a
Uh-huh.
giant forest. And it's
Okay.
amazing to have right here where, you have a city of 2 million people and you can be literally lost in this forest. Like I still get turned around because there's so many trails and it's easy to get disoriented because it's a really dense forest at times.
Okay.
Even though I've been running in here for like 15 years at this point. But anyways, there are two particular terms I use in that park. One is it's called the penitente, which is the steepest trail in the whole park. It's a very short segment. I think it's only like a quarter mile, like 450 meters of horizontal, but it's like 56% grade. So it's steeper than a staircase. It's really steep.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's one of the few FKTs in Quito that I don't have yet. So that's maybe on the list for this season. But it's really short. But that's a good way to like get some really steep vert in the park. And then the other term I use is called the Chosky Loop, which is obviously, well, maybe not obviously. I made up that one, and that's kind of over the years I've kind of Frankenstein's together what I think of as kind of the most runnable trails, and making a loop that takes usually about an hour for me. So it's kind of a standard, just like 60-minute run. I think it's about 8 miles. It's nice and hilly, but it's pretty easy terrain. So I do those two a lot. Um, and then outside of the metro, actually, where I spend almost all of my training time when I'm here doing big mountain prep is on Ruku. So Ruku is the big mountain that's right across the city from me. And that's the one that goes up to 4,700 meters. And then on that, you have the Polichaski. Chasky, I guess I'll give a little bit of context here as well. Chasky is not only my company, but Chasky is a word in Quechua, which is the indigenous language here in the Andes, which is where our name comes from. And the Chaskis were the OG kind of like trail runner messengers in the Incan Empire. So you hear the word Chasqui quite a bit in Andean culture. So the Polichaski Trail is the steepest trail that goes up Ruku. It climbs about 1,000 meters or 1,100 meters in about 5 kilometers. So 4,000 feet in about 3 miles. It's pretty steep. And it takes you up from the edge of the city to the top of the cable car. So there's a cable car that goes up from the city, and this basically parallels
Yep.
that.
The funicular. I remember
Yeah.
that.
Well, a funicular, I think, is technically a different thing. A cable car and a
Oh,
funicular,
I
I
thought it was
think,
funicular. It is a cable car?
it's a cable car. I think I don't know what
Okay.
the difference is, but I think they're different.
The difference, I think, is that a funicular is embedded. It's just on a track in the side of the
Yeah.
hill, as
No, this
opposed
is
to
a
a
cable car.
dangling
Yeah.
cable car.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's like a gondola. I don't know. They're probably all different things. But
Okay.
anyways, so you can take the cable car up the first 1,000 meters, or what I do is you can run up or hike up. And so the Polichaski is the trail that I probably do the most. I did it like literally probably 40 or 50 times last summer because I really wanted to get the record on that because it was Carl Egloff's and he'd had it for like 8 years. And I tried it for a
Uh-huh.
long time and I finally got it last summer. So I did a lot last summer and I use it a lot for workouts now because it's really steep. And I just know it really, really well. So it's a great benchmark for me is the Polichaski Trail. So you'll hear me write and talk about that trail all the time. Um, and then, yeah, Ruku is like the top of the mountain. So sometimes I'll literally just do Polichaski and just go up the first 1,000 meters and then come down. Or sometimes I'll go all the way to the top of the mountain, and then come back down. And then the Teleferico is the name of that, what do you call it? Cable car thing. So if you hear that. And then the
Okay.
other thing that I talk about here in this first post is Cotopaxi, and Rumiñahui, which are two big mountains that are outside of the city. So Cotopaxi National Park is this big national park that encompasses both these mountains. Cotopaxi, I would say, is the most iconic mountain in Ecuador. It's actually not the tallest, it's the second tallest. It's 5,893 meters, so just under 20,000 feet. And it's this beautiful, perfect conical volcano with a big glacier on top. It's really beautiful, super famous. If you Google it, you'll see amazing photos of it. And then Rumiñahui is a mountain that's kind of right across from it, and it's quite a bit shorter. It's about the same as Rugu. I think it's like 4.7, and it's like a nice little craggy kind of ridgeline mountain. But a lot of people will use that for acclimatization hikes or days when they're going to climb Cotopaxi. So they're
Uh-huh.
both beautiful mountains. They're pretty close to Quito, and yeah, I spent some time there
And you
earlier this
mentioned at
week.
some point Tambopaxi.
Yeah, Tambopaxi is just the name of the lodge that's in the park.
Okay.
Yep,
Hmm.
yep,
Okay. Great. Hmm.
yep. So hopefully that gets y'all oriented.
Well, I'm sure it'll take it. I've even been there a couple of times, and it's a big city, but that's really helpful. Yeah, at least to sort of put things in perspective. Um,
Sure.
so on New Year's, you talked about doing a run at very, very high altitude. Um, so how do you decide, sort of? I think it sounded a little bit spontaneous when you do things like that versus resting, where that fits. I mean, you were, I think, still on vacation, so maybe it's just random, but take us through that a little bit. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, last time we talked about how I structure training and kind of mapping out weeks at a time. I would say this transitionary period is kind of the opposite of that. It's very much like I wake up and sometimes it's sitting around all day and or doing touristy stuff, and sometimes it's, you know, okay, let's go do an 8 hour day on Rumiñahui, So it very much is more spur of the moment right now, and I think that I think it's important to give myself the space to have that kind of flexibility and just listen to like I said, my inner golden retriever, like what do I want to do? And what do I feel like doing? And if I feel lazy and I don't want to do anything, I'm just not going to do anything. And if I feel, hey, I want to go out for a short jog, I'll do that. So this on New Year's Eve, yeah, it was I I left Massachusetts on the 30th and was basically traveling until like the afternoon of the 31st when we got to Cotopaxi National Park. And at that point, I was like, I've been cooped up. I need to like go do something. So that was really where that came from, was just this feeling of it's beautiful. There's like an hour of daylight left, and I just want to go do a run in this really beautiful place. And that was a really great way to spend the last little bit of daylight of the year.
Nice, nice. Yeah. I drive your mother crazy sometimes because I need physical activity too. Not the kind of physical activity at the level you were at, but I go stir crazy and if we're just sitting around all day. So I'm like, let's go
Well,
for a walk. Let's play tennis. Let's play golf. Let's do something. It's like, can't you
like
sit
father,
still?
like son to an extent, I guess. Yep.
Maybe there might be a little bit of that in there. Okay,
Yep.
and then the next day you went up Cotopaxi, right?
Yep.
So, so is there a strategy behind, some days you're hiking, some days you're running? How do you decide that? Is that a intentional strategy, or is it again just sort of what your golden retriever want to do that day?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's almost two answers. I mean, I think for, like we just said, with the vacation stuff, it's very, or even this transition phase, I would say it's much more on a whim. There's no real method to the madness. Once it's in training, then it's actually a really interesting question, in, let's say, in a few weeks from now, when things are more structured. Um, then it really depends on what the goal is. So for right now, Project Himalaya, again, I can't tease too much, but that is not an event that's going to require a lot of actual running. So the amount of running that I do in training is going to be a lot lower as a percentage of my volume. It's something that I worry about it less. So last summer when I was training for UTMB Ecuador, which is an actual trail race here in Ecuador, it's a 50-mile race or something. And for that race, there's a lot of running in that race. So I made sure I did a lot more actual running, both on kind of my easier days and my structured, high quality days. I was making sure that I was mixing in both some hiking and a lot more running, and I was paying more attention to how much actual running I was doing. Now, I think what I'm training for, it's more about I need to be able to go uphill for a long time in challenging conditions, moving pretty slowly, but slowly relative to, running,
Yes.
but, but still fairly quick. So that's really my focus is basically just on developing my overall engine, my cardiovascular system, and the strength needed to move uphill. So if anything, I will probably emphasize more on hiking, on vert, on doing uphill stuff more than I would on running, just because that's the specific needs of this project.
Okay. So you tailor it within this block as you big block to what the
Exactly.
goal of the block is.
Yep.
And
100%.
as a side note, having been there for, first of all, it's amazing to me that you can run from Mindo to Quito because I have driven that and it's a long drive and a lot uphill. I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
up, I don't know how far it is, but it's a lot uphill. And second, for those listening out in podcast land, if you go to Ecuador, you should check out Mindo because there's more
Yeah.
hummingbirds there than about any place else in the world. And it's
Yeah.
unbelievable to see them all. There's just hundreds and maybe thousands of them.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to see. And it's a very cool place, kind of in the middle of the jungle, which
Yep.
Ecuador has a lot of.
Yep.
Okay, back to the story here. So that makes sense. So you're kind of okay, I need a lot of climbing capability, so I'm going to focus more on hiking as opposed to running,
Yep.
which was what you were doing when you had to run the trail from Mindo to Quito. How far
Yep.
is that,
Exactly.
by the way? How high? What's the vertical vert, as you call it?
From Mindo to Quito or in that whole race. And
Yeah,
for the
Mindo to
record,
Quito,
yeah, so what we're
or
talking
whatever the
about,
race
this is
was that you
in,
ran.
so UTMB Quito is what we're talking about here. So this was the race I ran last summer. And it ran from a town called Mindo, which is in the cloud forest, up to Quito. And Mindo, I think, sits at like 1,000 meters, like below 4,000 feet. And Quito is here at almost 10,000 feet. And you run up over the mountains to get there. So I want to say, I think the course topped out around 4,000 meters. So, you're doing 3,000 meters of net gain, and then you kind of bomb down into the city at the very end with a really steep
Wow.
descent. It's a super cool race. Yeah, it's amazing because you go literally from this humid tropical cloud forest where, like you're saying, there's hummingbirds, there's toucans, there's monkeys, there's all this crazy stuff, and then a few hours later, you're in the Altiplano, which is the high mountain country where it's just like grassy scrub. And there's those foxes and hawks and these animals and plants that live up in the real high country. It's crazy.
Yep. Yep. And another aside, just from it always blows my mind. Um, So if we take an example, well, Manaslu is the most famous one. So you ran this big mountain in the Himalayas near all the famous mountains called, and actually it's a famous mountain to people who do mountains, I
Yeah.
guess, called Mount Manaslu, right?
Hmm.
And how long did that take you, the FKT or fastest known time?
So yeah, that from base camp to the summit was 9 hours and 52 minutes.
Okay. So just for perspective, not me, because I would never even make it up to base camp probably, but for, like a normal middle-aged person who's very fit, how long would it take them to do that?
So it's a tricky question because most people wouldn't do it in one push. They would do it over a few days. So the way that most people, Monte is the eighth highest mountain in the world. It's one of the 14 8,000-meter mountains, which are about 25,000 feet. There's only 14 of those mountains. And most people, when they climb 8,000ers, they'll do kind of a siege style where they'll have at least one, usually two or three camps above base camp. And so they'll go up
Yeah,
to camp one,
that's
they'll go up to camp
fine.
two, they'll go up to
That's
camp four.
legit. So it takes
So
them days.
it takes them a couple of days. Yeah. There are a handful of people, Chris Fisher, my climbing partner, he also did a push from base camp to the summit. I think it took him about 15 hours. and there are a handful of
Okay.
people. The previous record was
But
12
Chris is
hours.
also an
Chris is
outlier.
a world-class mountain athlete for sure. Yeah. So no, normal people, it's, I would say even doing it in 2 days, doing one camp and then going to the summit would be pretty exceptional. So most people are probably doing it over 3 days as a minimum.
Right. And even if you just count the net time climbing, it's probably 25 hours, something like that.
Yeah, that's probably correct.
Okay. Yeah. And because I remember the same thing about Kilimanjaro. How long did it take you to run up and down Mount Kilimanjaro?
Um,
Like
I think the
10
uphill was like
hours?
4.5 hours and the round trip was 6.5 hours, something like that.
Yeah. And so again, I
Yeah.
know people who've climbed Kilimanjaro. I have not done it, but it's a week typically,
Yeah,
as I
it
recall.
can, it's a, yeah, it can be a long route. We did the steepest route, but I would say still probably most people are doing that over, you know, three
Okay.
to 5 days. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to put your freakish capability in perspective, always this does blow my mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Something I cannot imagine.
Yeah.
Um, okay. And that brings us maybe into talking a little bit about altitude. So
Yeah.
you do a lot of this training at high altitude. You were mentioning 4,700 meters or whatever it was at Cotopaxi. That's really high. And I remember when you were talking a little bit back about even your pacing around Polichaski or whatever it was you were talking about. You're talking about, well, oh, the Chosky takes me about an hour and it's about 8 miles or something. And I'm thinking, okay, that's really slow for a person who's, won 4 Vermont marathons. And so I know how fast you can run. So is that just totally altitude effect pretty much? So talk a little bit about, the difference between Massachusetts and Quito and how altitude affects all your training.
Yeah, I think going back to my intro essay, I think we talked about, people who are performing at a high level in anything are going to be kind of freaks to some extent and have some kind of freakish capability. And the people who are, I think, the most successful are those who can really lean into their weird outlier freak capability. And for me, for whatever reason, thanks to my parents and my genetics partly, dealing with hypoxia and altitude is one of the things that my body is really, really good at. And I've really leaned into that as I've become more focused on big mountain stuff. And I think I realized it even way before that, though, because you're right, running at 9 or 10,000 feet as a runner when I was training for more, marathons and track and field and that kind of stuff, for most people, that is too high. If you look at where most pro runners train, it's usually between 5 and I would say 7,000 feet. Like Flagstaff is 7,000 feet, which is kind of on the upper end of where most runners feel comfortable training. And for me, even back in college, I was training here in Quito or I was training in Pisac in Peru, which are about the same, about 9 or 10,000 feet. And I always felt amazing there. And I remember like bringing some of my college friends down and they like really struggled. And I was like, what, like, what's the matter, guys? Why can't you train here?
Yeah.
And so I think everybody has kind of different tolerance levels and different red lines. And now for me, I spend almost all of my time at altitude right now. Like for the last few years, I've spent almost all my time like here in Ecuador or, in Flagstaff or in Colorado or in Nepal in the mountains. And so I'm pretty much at altitude year round. And it's an important part of my training, not so much in the way that it used to be as a runner, where you would train at altitude. And the idea is you're in this hypoxic environment where there's less oxygen. And so your body adapts to that. It develops more red blood cells, which makes it easier for you to then go down to sea level and compete. And you have, a training boost or a performance boost down there. Now it's almost the opposite where I'm training at, what I think of as kind of a medium altitude here in Quito. And I'm going up higher and higher in training. And then, where I'm going to compete and to perform is actually really high up, way over 20,000 feet, up to 8,000 meters. And so I'm preparing for that. And then, we'll talk later about how that kind of fits in, but it's about getting really fit here and then eventually kind of eking up a little bit more altitude, each week or each month and getting ready for that. And, so yeah, I think altitude is one of the things for me that has kind of been something that
A
just
superpower, as we
yeah,
say.
for whatever reason, it's something that I've always just feel like have dealt with really well as a stimulus and as a kind of adversity factor in performance, and so that's I've kind of leaned into it. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, which, as parents, sometimes doesn't overly excite us. We prefer the beach.
Sure. I mean, I love the mountains. Also, I think that all like endurance athletes, there's like this whole thing where everybody wants to be, Usain Bolt or, everyone wants to be the
Yeah.
shortest distance because that's like the coolest
Yeah.
and the sexiest, right? And then
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
the problem with me was like I found out very early that as stuff got longer, I got better at it. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
So then I got pushed into like, marathons early and I was running the 10K in college and then eventually into ultras and now into the really big mountain stuff. It's like it just keeps getting longer and slower and like less and less sexy and cool.
Well, I have to say, I think the mountain running stuff is the coolest of all by far, just for the adventure and thrill. Although, again, as your father, the adventure and thrill sometimes I could do without because there is some real danger there. We can come back and talk about that a little bit, but you have to know what you're doing. And when you're in a
Yeah.
hypoxic environment, as you say, there's not a lot of room for error.
Yeah.
Um,
And no, I'm speaking tongue in cheek. I'm super like I'm very, very happy to be in the competitive field that I am. I love being in the mountains. It's very, very good for my soul to be up in the mountains and, somewhere really beautiful like that. So I wouldn't want to
yeah,
be back on the track. I'd get bored.
yeah. Okay, so reading through your training log, speaking of, concerned parents,
Sure.
I read your story about uh, Rumiñahui. Is that how you say it? Rumiñahui?
Rumiñahui.
Rumiñahui, sorry.
Rumiñahui.
Rumiñahui, which is the other mountain near Cotopaxi, right?
Yep. Yep.
And you talked about a gully and some sketchy moments and rocks falling on your head and cracking your skull open. Just the thing a parent
They
wants to
didn't fall
read.
on my head and crack my skull open.
But the mere fact that that was a possibility, yeah,
We were
doesn't
wearing
make mom and
helmets
me.
for what it's worth. You
Oh,
wear a
good.
helmet
I'm
on that
glad.
mountain.
I'm
So,
glad you were wearing helmets. That sounds like a
yeah.
good, safe thing to do. Anyway, so tell me a little bit about what that was like. And I would imagine at the least it's got to be a little anxiety provoking, if not, you know, panic striking for us, for your mom and me. I'm sure it would be crazy. We'd be just, because I remember actually, I don't know if you remember, but we went, with you once to Machu Picchu and went up
Hmm.
Huayna Picchu,
Yeah.
the tiny, super steep mountain behind it. And literally, I remember we had to slide down on a flat rock, wet rock, like
I remember
50
that.
feet
Yeah.
or something, which was not comfortable.
It was maybe like 8 feet.
Okay. It felt like it was a mile. But anyway, these high mountains that are very steep can have treacherous places. So tell me how you think about that and how you try and, stay calm or do whatever you do to navigate your way through those things.
Yeah, I think stay calm is the most important thing. And I think that's one of the things that I've developed a lot over the last few years of just being more comfortable in the mountains and whatever Mother Nature throws at you, and sometimes, Polichaski Trail that I do almost every day it's basically just walking up a really steep hillside. There's nothing scary about that. And then sometimes, yeah, this was a new route on Rumiñahui that I hadn't done before, and it was not the most popular route. It was, there's kind of a standard route, and then this is on the other side of the mountain. We're trying to make a big traverse of it, and it's yeah, it was just you get things thrown at you that are unexpected, and especially here in the Andes, in this part of the Andes, you have a lot of mountains that are kind of crumbly, and the rock can be kind of falling off and can be loose. It can be wet. You get weather that comes in. So I think it's all about learning to deal with those things and recognizing what is something that might be alarming in terms of this is a signal that you should maybe change plans or turn around versus what is something that might feel scary but is actually just fine. And that is one of these gut things that you just learn through experience, I think. I don't think there's really any way to fake that. It's like driving a car, right? You realize very quickly when you learn to drive that there are things that are problematic, whether it's really bad weather or a problem with the vehicle or someone swerving around the road that you want to be super aware of. And then there are certain things where when you first start driving are really scary, like just going really fast on the highway can be really scary, or driving at night can be hard and scary. So it's the difference between recognizing what is fear that is indicating that there's something wrong that you should be paying attention to, and then there's fear that's just, oh, I'm startled or something like that, right? For me, again, we're in vacation mode, so I take no risk. Like there's no point in doing anything, because the last thing I want to do is get hurt or do something stupid that results in an injury or a problem before I even start training. My risk calculus does change over the course of the season, and especially if I'm on an FKT day or something where I'm going for something that's important, even just the way that I go into that day, the gear that I'm bringing, the amount of food or water that I'm carrying, those things in and of themselves represent an amount of risk tolerance that I would not take on a day in early January going for a hike with friends. Like those are totally
Yeah.
different ends of the spectrum. So
Yeah.
it's that my risk calculus, I would say, if anything, I'm on like way on the conservative side. And that's why I think it's funny when my mom will often say like, oh, you're a risk taker and you're a thrill seeker and all these things. It's like, no, I'm the guy in the climbing party who's like a huge baby. And I'm like, no, like, let's go back because there's lightning. I don't like it. Like, I feel like my risk tolerance is way lower than a lot of people in the mountain world, partly because I come from a running background. So a lot of the mountain stuff is still relatively new to me. I've only been doing it really at a competitive level for 4 or 5 years now. And it's your 10,000 hour rule. It just takes time to get comfortable with that stuff. So I think my risk tolerance in general is quite low. And it gets even lower when the stakes are lower, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So why didn't you go to the summit that day? What caused you and your calculus to change your mind there?
There were two things. One
Or at
was that the
least the
weather.
first, I
Yeah.
think you eventually got to the summit, but the
Yeah, so
first
we ended
time.
up going to the Central Summit, which is kind of the normal route. The North Summit was the first one that we were going to, and basically we didn't know what the route was going to be like, and we got up there, and it was 20 meters away or something, but we get up to this little saddle, and it's just like a big thumb of rock. It's like really serious exposed
What's a
rock
saddle?
climbing. A saddle is just like a low point between two peaks.
Okay.
So we get up to this saddle and you can see here's the North Summit. It's like right there, but it's just like a big thumb of rock. It's like 60 or 70-degree rock, that you would have to just climb up.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
wet, it's cloudy now. And I was like, that seems kind of sketchy. And yeah, so decided not to do that. And the weather was changing. So again, it's one of these things where there just was no real motivation to push. I think I'm someone who I don't get summit fever when it doesn't matter to me that much, if it's just a fun day, it was already a cool adventure and
Yeah.
there's no reason to take extra risk at that point.
Yeah. So that's one thing I guess you do learn even at your stage is I've done a lot of summits. I don't really have to do this summit.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just
Hmm.
I have nothing to prove to anyone,
Right.
on vacation.
Right. Right. And you mentioned being inside a ping pong ball at some point. What does that mean? I never heard of
Oh,
that
yeah.
phrase before.
That's just a phrase. I use that a lot. I don't know if it's a common thing. It basically just means you're in a whiteout, right? If you imagine you're inside a ping pong ball, all you see is white, right? It means you can't see
Okay.
anything.
So was it snowing or how
No,
did you
just
end up
super
in a
cloudy,
whiteout?
just like foggy. Not whiteout
Oh, so
snow,
literally you're up so
just
high you're
fog.
in the clouds.
Yeah, you're in the
Hmm.
clouds. Yep.
Right. I forget. I always forget just how high it is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And then you also talked about Rumiñahui as type 2 fun, I think you called it. What's type 2 fun?
Yeah, so type 1 fun, type 2 fun. I think this is actually a very common thing in endurance sport. So type 1 fun would be something where it's fun in the moment. You're having a great time in the moment. You're out jogging with your friends. It's a beautiful sunny day. You feel great. There's birds chirping, whatever. It also doesn't have to be sport. Type 1 fun could be, playing cards with your family or watching a movie. It's fun in the moment. It's hedonistic. Type 2 fun is fun that is fun after the fact. Like it's not fun in the moment. Like yesterday when we were recording the intro podcast, we were talking about the trip to Arizona and for my Achilles surgery
Yeah.
and kind of laughing about it in retrospect. That's kind of type 2 fun because like at the time it was really not that fun, but now we can kind of look back a year later and laugh and say, yeah, that was pretty funny. And so a lot of endurance sport is type 2 fun. It's at the moment you're suffering, you feel miserable, and then at the end, or maybe a few days later, or a few hours later, or sometimes like a year later, you can look back on it and be like, yeah, you know what, that was a really fun experience. And
Yeah.
it can be literally looking back on it as fun, or sometimes it's looking back on it as just it was powerful, important, special, whatever that is.
Yep. Yeah. Well, maybe we probably we're a little long in the tooth here on this session, but maybe we can talk about this a little more later because that's Seymour Papert, who's a famous person in my world, used to talk about education, and he talked about hard fun. Um,
Mm.
that when you're often, in fact, there's an old phrase, right? You do something really hard, and the phrase in the US is, well, that was an education. Um, and that's what it means. I was like, well, it wasn't so much fun at the time, but looking back on it, you learn a lot. And so we can talk about
Exactly.
that another time, but that's interesting. Okay, so now we know what type 2 fun is.
Yep.
Okay, so now you did something called the Polichaski Trail when you talked about your first real workout. What made you choose that one?
Yeah, Polichaski, like I said before, it's really my benchmark. So partly I love it, and it's my favorite trail, and I like how familiar I am with it. I like how pretty it is. I like how quiet it is. And also I'm very data driven and I like to know where I am. And one of the ways that I do that is I will use the same trails or running routes as kind of indicators of my fitness. So it was a very good just
So it's a benchmark for you.
exactly. It's a benchmark. So that
Okay.
was that was a really good one for me running. I think I ran it just under an hour. It was like 59:50 or something. And that's really, really solid for my first time out, having like basically been sitting around eating Ben and Jerry's and hanging out on the couch for 2 weeks. So like being able to start there, these first couple weeks, I think I'll do a handful of workouts on that trail to just really get a sense of where my fitness is at to start. And then like we talked last time about how I map out training, that will really allow me to dial in those first few weeks of more structured training because I'll have a really good sense of where I am now, and then I can
Yeah.
compare that to my last build up here, which was like June to August, and I can see okay, I'm a little bit ahead or I'm a little bit behind, and then I can kind of compare and write out some similar workouts. So far so good. Knock on wood. I think if anything, I'm a little bit ahead of where I expected to be and ahead of last season, which is really great.
Yeah. Okay. So as a very fit 68-year-old almost, which is where I am, I pay a lot of attention to heart rate and heart rate variability. So I know just
Hmm.
enough to be dangerous might be the way to put it. But you log your heart rate in your training log, and curious as to how you think about heart rate. And maybe I could even learn something from you about how that affects your training and your fitness and how you use it as a variable.
Yeah, so heart rate for me, I often use as an indicator that I'm in the right energy system when I'm training. And so I try to, most of my training days and most of my training volume is what I would consider easy to moderate. So if you're in like a heart rate zone system, that's probably zone one or zone two. If I look to a lot of high
And the
level.
zones, again, if
Yep.
I'll do the quick review here as the
Sure.
professor. So there's 5 zones that are typically, although sometimes people use 4, but it doesn't matter. Zone
Yep.
one is the lowest zone of heart rate. So your lowest heart rate walking, lying in bed, whatever. Zone two is usually considered the first type of aerobic behavior, 60% of your heart rate, but really you're at enough effort where it starts to become a little challenging to have a conversation, but you can still have a conversation. So,
Yep.
and then zone five is all the way at the other end. That's all out, VO2
Yep.
max, which we can talk about maybe a little later. You're just trying to go as hard as you can, and your heart rate is as high as you're at close to your
Yeah.
maximum heart rate.
Yep. That sounds about right. I think VO2 max is probably a little bit lower than max heart rate. VO2 max is usually about 9 minute effort. So the way that I think about paces and efforts is usually goes back to running, which is essentially for a race of X number of minutes. So VO2 max with running is usually a race of like 7 to 9 minutes. It's like your all out heart rate for 7 to 9 minutes that you could hold. So for elite men, that's like a 3K. Um, and then, I talk about CV critical velocity. That's about 30-minute race pace. And then LT lactate threshold, which is about 60-minute race pace. So like those are the metrics that I think about. And then for me, I can look at what heart rates
So
those
slow down a
correspond
second
to.
because that was a lot, at
Yeah,
least
yeah.
for me. So, okay. So I'll start from the back because that's what I remember. So lactate threshold, you said is
Yep.
60 minutes. So
Yep.
60 minutes as hard as you can run for 60 minutes or
Right. Right. Yeah.
okay.
So
And
lactate threshold literally means it's the threshold where your body starts producing, and we don't need to get too into the weeds on this
yeah,
because I know
yeah.
we're trying to keep it a little bit less technical. But essentially, when your body is exercising hard, you start producing lactate in your blood, and your
Yep.
body is also able to clear that out. And as you as you start working harder, you reach a point, a threshold where your body starts producing more lactate than it can clear out of your bloodstream, and that's
Yep.
called the lactate threshold. And in theory, a 60-minute effort is generally run at maximum speed right around your lactate threshold. So you're basically right on the edge of where your body is creating just as much lactate as you can clear out. And so for
Okay.
an elite male runner, that would be about a half marathon pace. The elite men are running around 1 hour in the half marathon. So,
Yep.
that's how I use that term. People use it differently. And again, I'm not doing lactate testing. I'm not doing any of that. I'm using this as an approximation for specific efforts and specific heart rates that I use in training.
Yep. And then you said critical velocity.
Yeah.
So
So
what is critical velocity?
critical velocity again is another pace that I have come to through the running world and has been popularized in I'd say like the last 5 or 6 years. And this is about half of that. So it's about 30-minute race pace. So it's slower than VO2 max. It's faster than lactate threshold. It's again, for an elite male, it's probably around 10K race pace. And so for me, that corresponds to a heart rate in the like mid 170s when I'm up here, whereas LT is usually below 170. I think my lactate threshold is right around 167 to 168 up here. Like if I can feel like if I hit 170 and I'm trying to do LT, it's too hard.
Okay. Wow. So it's that precise. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so you use these. So how do these fit into your training regime?
So when I structure my week, like I said, most of my training is easy zone one, zone two. And then 2 to 3 days a week, I will do some combination of higher intensity work where it's much more structured. And the
Okay.
idea that I try to do when we zoom out and look at a whole season is the early season workouts should be pretty easy. They're usually shorter reps, more rest at those higher intensity paces. And then as the season progresses, the harder repetitions get longer, the rest gets shorter, the overall volume will increase. So you have all these different variables that you can play with. And the idea is really just to get fitter, and to develop your overall aerobic capacity. And the way that I found it works for me and my body is that touching those higher end paces will improve all my capacity across everything. So it'll improve my capacity at zone one, zone two, and my ability to move at speed at that lower intensity, as well as my ability to move at speed at those higher intensity heart rates. So, for example, if I'm doing a huge effort in the Himalaya that's going to take 10 to 20 hours, I'm not going to be touching lactate threshold or critical velocity or any of this stuff. So a layman might ask, why are you doing that in training? It's because by working on those higher end paces and those higher heart rates, it improves my ability to move quicker at lower heart rates, which is what I will be doing on that FKT day. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So I think you call it the engine, right? So you're building
Exactly.
up the
You're
engine,
building up the
but
engine.
you're not going to redline the engine and run it at max
No.
over a really, really long race.
No. But as you work the engine in training at these really high intensities, it improves the overall efficiency of the engine at
Right,
every speed. That's
right,
the idea.
right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So how does this first week of training fit into your overall block here towards Project Himalaya?
I think twofold. I think the first thing is it's still just about trying to stay relaxed and have fun. There's plenty of time over the next, 4 months to be super focused and diligent and make all those sacrifices and go to bed early and get up early and blah, blah, blah. So part of it is like, I don't want to be too stressed out about, not even stressed out, just too focused on training right now. I'm trying to mix in training with also, I just got down to Quito and I'm spending time with people that I really like. And I'm, going up to restaurants with my friends and staying up too late and all these things that I will not do for like the next 3 months. So I'm letting myself do those things now and enjoying it. And I think the other thing is, like I said, just that one workout on the Polichaski Trail. That's kind of how I view these transition weeks is okay, if I can get in like one day a week that I feel really good about, that's fine. And everything else will just kind of take care of itself. And so to me, that workout, especially sneaking just under an hour, like the difference between running like 60-10 and 59-50 for me is like really significant. And so like the fact that I was able to get in just
Seriously, it
under
really
an
is in terms
it
of
like
your
makes no sense. It's just that's 100% in my
okay. So
mind.
it's just
Like
an emotional
it's
thing.
just an emotional thing of, but like like an hour for me is a benchmark. So it's like, oh, the fact that I could do that in my very first time out, you know, that's a really good sign. And so to me, if anything, that makes me feel like I can relax a little bit more in these weeks and not be too stressed out about, oh, I really need to get back to training soon. Like I have plenty of time. I'm already fitter than I expected, and that's a really good place to start.
Okay. And is that you wrote a lot about well, at least a couple of times, I guess, about that I caught about being tired, lacking sleep, too many early days and long nights and early mornings or something like that. So how do you balance that, and where does that fit in terms of making sure your recovery is okay? Is this just a different week because you're kind of on vacation and you're not as disciplined
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah, it's a vacation week, it's a travel week, so I just kind of go into it with the assumption that like I'm gonna be a little tired. And again, I'm gonna enjoy those longer days and saying yes to more social opportunities that come up just because I know that
Yeah.
a month from now I'm not gonna do that. So I'm giving myself the
Yes, we
space
have
to say
seen
yes.
that. We have seen the monk behavior,
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
hermit behavior.
Yeah. And that's, I love that too. I love getting into my routine and having that super dialed tunnel vision focus on training. And I think that's one
Hmm.
of my kind of other freakish superpowers is my ability to be able to do that when it matters. But I think part of the reason I can do that is because I know that it's not forever and that I will have these times where I let myself, have a little bit more of a relaxed lifestyle and a little bit more fun.
Well,
What do you, what do
congratulations
you think?
on hitting your benchmark early and
Thank
and
you.
feeling like you're a little ahead of the game.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely takes some of the pressure off. And, I think over the next week or two, as I get a little bit more into training, we'll do a couple more kind of benchmark sessions and then I'll really have a good sense of exactly where I am. So, but yeah, for now, I'm feeling great and just excited to be here in Quito, enjoy having fun, seeing a lot of people that I really like and running on some of my favorite trails in the whole world. So, yeah, it's been a good first week. Welcome back. We are here with our cool down for our first weekly episode here. And Mr. C, why don't you go ahead and introduce this week's topic?
Yeah. So you recently posted a list of 16 things that you want to keep in mind as you're working through this training block. So can we talk about what made you do that and the context and then go through them?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll post this on the blog and Substack version if you guys want to go see my original list for my notebook. It's literally like taped to my mirror now, to remind myself of all these things. But I remember writing this on the flight back from Asia to the United States after my fall season. So this was, well, that season was really successful and it was fresh in my mind. I wanted to kind of write almost like a letter to my future self of, here's some stuff to think about while you're thinking about this next training block. And, some of it is a little bit technical, some of it is more very big picture stuff. But yeah, let's just walk through it and we can kind of explain one by one. Some of it's really obvious and some of it will require a little more explanation.
Okay. So number one is don't get greedy. So
Yeah, I think, and for what it's worth, these were basically just as they occurred to me. So I actually do think this is the most important one, other than number 16, which is don't die. But number one, I think for me was I have a tendency to always want to do more. And I think part of that comes from a sense of insecurity that I've always felt like I needed to work harder than people who were more naturally talented than me. And so I've always had this chip on my shoulder and this need to kind of prove myself and train harder than my teammates or train harder than myself last time. And I think this was the reminder that you don't get greedy. Like, don't try and do too much. Don't try and show off. Don't let your ego get too involved in your training. Don't try and do too many things. That if you keep it simple and you do what has worked before, then you're going to be successful. I think that's the simplest way to explain that.
okay. And number two seems sort of obvious, but give us your thoughts on don't get injured.
Yeah, don't get injured. I mean, it goes with don't get greedy. I think that I recognize that to be successful in May, um, the most important thing is to have consistent training. So I would rather train a tiny bit lower than my absolute max capacity, but be 100% sure that I'm not going to hurt myself. And so these first few really go back to not getting greedy. It's erring on the side of caution and prioritizing staying healthy over, squeezing every single drop out of the proverbial lemon.
And so that's where don't get sick fits in. I mean,
Yeah.
what does that really mean to you?
Yeah, that's more specific to Nepal because one of the issues that Chris and I both had in Nepal the last few expeditions is it is a harsh environment. There's very different germs. It's pretty easy to pick up either like a respiratory thing or a like a stomach bug, and those can really derail training. So again, going back to don't get greedy, which is why it's number one, it's you are more susceptible to those things if you're more run down from training really hard. So maybe dial the training back 5% and try and let your body be a little bit more able to deal with those things. And even just reminding myself, okay, if there's some delicious street food, maybe this is not the year to experiment with it and just like eat stuff out of a can or something.
Okay. So number four is minimize outside stress and travel. Again, seems sort of straightforward. Is there any subtlety there?
Yeah, not really. That one's pretty straightforward. I think over the last 4 months, from really when I left here in Quito in August until right now, I've been on the move all the time. And part of me loves that, but it's also really tiring and it can be very hard to be consistent with training when I'm in that mode of changing places and changing time zones and repacking and packing and all these things and living out of a suitcase. And I think part of the reason that last summer was so successful was because I was really just dialed in and focused and here and had my routine, like we were talking about me being a monk and just like settling into that. I think that's really what I want for this block is just to be here, be in my routine. And, you know, if there's something that is exciting, but is going to require a bunch of travel or something that's going to stress me out, then I'm just not going to do it for now. I'll do it later.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Number five, you don't need to be fitter than Manaslu.
Yeah, this is one of the most important things that I realized was I think the fall season went really, really well. And usually we as endurance athletes are always looking for how can I be fitter next season than I was this season? What can I do differently to be better, to run my marathon a little bit faster? And this is almost a slightly different approach than I've ever had, which is, okay, again, all of it goes back to don't get greedy. I don't think that I need to be fitter than I was in the fall to accomplish what I want to in May on Project Himalaya. I'm pretty sure that if I took that exact fitness and I teleported that person to the mountain where I will be in May for this project, I will be 100% successful. I'm very sure of that. So I this is where the don't get greedy comes from. I don't need to be doing more. I don't have anything to prove to myself. If I can really replicate the training that I did last summer and get into similar shape by the time I go over to Nepal, then I'm very confident that I'll be successful.
So this is about pushing yourself, but let's say in the 80 to 100% range as opposed to the 110% range. You're not trying to
Yeah.
stretch your fitness or your capabilities,
Yeah.
but you want to maintain them at a very high level.
Exactly. Using
Okay.
we
Hmm.
talked about benchmarks a lot. So if I'm hitting the same benchmarks as I know I've been hitting in the past buildup last year, then I'm fine. I don't need to be faster. I just need to be in the same range.
Right. Right. And that's good because that means your fitness is high enough that you don't have to push it right to the edge. I
Exactly.
know in every sport, at least certainly in tennis and golf, um, you don't want to be, this is a problem with amateur golfers in particular, and you can see it all the time. They're just trying to swing right out of their shoes, and hit the ball absolutely every time as hard as they can. And if you watch professionals, they don't do that. They can hit the ball much harder and further than they do. And they're not pussyfooting. They're in that 80 to 100% range, right? Where they're
Yeah.
good enough that they can, and the control that that gives them is well worth the trade-off in not pushing it right to the edge. So that's kind of what you're saying?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Number six, weekly double TCV work.
Yeah, so now we get into a little bit more of the technical stuff. So this is we were talking earlier in this episode about quality training. So this is me kind of outlining, okay, what are the actual training specific things that I want to be doing? And this is the first one, which is every week I'd like to be doing um, some amount of double T, which is lactate threshold and critical velocity training. So ideally 2 days a week where I'm doing 2 sessions a day. So 4 total sessions in a week of that
Okay.
higher quality stuff.
So that's just trying to remind yourself to get these kinds of workouts in.
Yep.
Uh-huh. And
Yep.
why are those workouts important? Do they're the ones that really make sure you stay at the level of fitness you need to be?
Yeah, I think those are the ones like we talked about before, where you're really stressing the high end of the engine, and then you see the benefits all the way across. That's where I think most of the benefit comes from.
Okay. And then 20 to 30 hours of aerobic training per week, 5 to 10 on the bike.
Yeah, that's again just looking or reminding myself, okay, these are the kind of numbers that we're looking at. 20 to 30 hours a week, I think is a really good number for me where I feel comfortable with that. It's a lot, but it's not too much where I feel like it's getting greedy. And those 5 to 10 hours a week on the bike, I think are really important because they add a nice gentle aerobic stimulus. Usually I'm not going hard on the bike. It's more a way to add just some zone 1, zone 2 hours. But it's on a bicycle. It's completely non-impact. So the injury risk is much lower and reminding myself
Yep.
like that's okay, especially in this context.
Okay. And then strength and plyos, 1 to 2x a week.
Yep.
Okay. What does
So
that
those
mean?
strength, I mean, this is me doing gym work essentially. So strength training, I think, is really important, especially for big uphill stuff. I want to be a little bit stronger than I am normally when I'm doing running, just trail running. There's just more muscle mass involved. And then plyometrics is something that I started incorporating more after my Achilles surgery as part of my rehab. And I feel like that really helped me both in terms of my just efficiency moving as well as making sure that I do keep on top of that left Achilles and it stays healthy. Even now, more than a year later, there's still some little things where I feel it's a little bit weaker. And so I'm still, it's a good thing because I still feel like there's meat on the bone in terms of like getting it to 100% equal with the right side. And plyometrics is one of those things where I still see that. And I'm still, redeveloping that left Achilles tendon a little bit.
And what's the 30-second version of plyometrics?
Plyometrics it basically just means jumping exercises. They're explosive exercises. They're really short and intense. So like think about skipping, bounding, hopping, jumping, those kind of things that you would do.
Okay.
Yep, in the gym.
Okay. Okay. Number 9, don't need a ton of super long runs.
Yeah, this is something that actually surprised me from last summer, and it was kind of a coincidental thing that I found was I was doing, maybe 3 to 4 hours of training a day here in Quito. Sometimes it was split up into 2 sessions, but I did almost no really long runs, and by really long runs, I mean 6+ hours, say. And this was training for an actual running race, and then obviously that translated well into my fall season. So really long runs are great. They're really fun sometimes, but they're also pretty demanding on the body in a lot of different ways. And I found that doing a lot of kind of medium length training sessions, but keeping the overall training volume high, it was a way to be more consistent. I felt like I wasn't quite as destroyed as I would be after like a 6 or 8 hour run. And I did have some, but they were much later in the season. After, I obviously had the UTMB Quito race, which was I can't even remember, 8 hour race maybe. And then, I had some 8 to 12 hour days after that, before going to Manaslu. And so I do have some of that stuff mapped out for, the last month or so of my training block. But here while I'm in Quito, I think it's more important to just be really consistent and hitting those kind of medium days every day.
Okay. And then number 10, last 4 to 8 weeks, focus on higher altitude.
Yep. Yeah. So this obviously Project Himalaya is a big high altitude project. Here, I think of it kind of as medium altitude here in Quito now. So we're at 3,000 meters, and I'm not really focused on doing anything super, super high. It's more about developing the engine and the overall fitness for these first, say, 3 months. And then the last 1 to 2 months will be more about getting ready for the altitude. So that's when I start thinking about, okay, do I start playing around with the altitude tent here in Quito, which is kind of ridiculous? Do I, once I get to Nepal, thinking about, okay, where am I going to stage myself so that I'm a little bit higher up and I'm starting to go up taller and taller mountains so that by the time May comes around, I'm ready to go on, a really big mountain.
Okay. And the altitude tent is something that lets you depressurize a little bit inside a tent so that you get the same, exactly what it says. You're like at altitude, because we've known you sleeping in this in
Yep.
Massachusetts forever, which is at sea level, of course, and that lets you sleep at like 10,000 feet or 15,000 feet. And your idea is using that starting at 15 or 12,000, whatever feet Quito is, and pushing yourself up ever higher to try and get closer to those 7,000, 8,000 meter kind of levels. Is
Yeah,
that right?
exactly. It's and one small correction, it's not changing the air pressure, it's changing the oxygen concentration. So it's making
Yeah,
the
yeah,
air
that's
hypoxic
true.
without
Right. So
impacting the
you're not
pressure.
lowering the pressure, which is
Yep.
another thing that happens
It's
in the real world.
simulating the the oxygen concentration at high altitude. But yeah, so the idea that I would use it for would essentially be when I go to Nepal, I'll probably go from sleeping here in Quito at 3,000 meters to sleeping at about 5,000 meters. And the idea would be to make that transition easier so that I can basically just go from here to there and feel really comfortable immediately.
Yep. Okay. Try not to sleep, number 11, try not to sleep higher than 5,000 meters. So why do you want
Yeah.
to limit your height there?
So this is one where I kind of buck the conventional wisdom where a lot of people, when they're prepping for 8,000 meters, will go up on the mountain and they'll sleep at 6,000, and then they'll go up and they'll sleep at 7,000, and maybe for Everest they'll sleep at 8,000, and then they'll come down and rest. I've found that I just I hate that. It's really hard on my body. I don't like sleeping higher than 5,000 meters, and I've found that I can be successful without doing that. So, and even Everest Base Camp, where Chris and I were last spring for Lhotse, is 5,300. And for me, I think there really is a red line right around 5,000 meters, where on Manaslu Base Camp, which is 4.7, I think, so it's 600 meters lower, 2,000 feet. That 2,000 feet to me makes a huge difference. I can, we lived there for 3 weeks. I felt great. I was sleeping great. I was training hard. I was recovering decently well. Whereas at EBC, I never really felt like I got that. So that's a reminder to me of, okay, if you can avoid it, try and keep everything below 5,000
Okay, that makes sense.
for sleeping.
Yeah,
For
because we
sleeping, obviously
forget,
going
yeah,
up higher,
for even for freakish people like you,
there is a line.
sleeping at 5,000, 6,000 meters, it's got to be tough.
Yeah.
Okay. 12, one trip to 7,400 to 8,000 meters, 3 to 5 days recovery.
Yep.
So what's
So
that
this
mean?
is this is kind of like my last big acclimatization push that I would do before going for the actual record that I'm going to go for. So when I did Manaslu, my highest push was like it was way lower. It was actually only 6,600 meters, and then I went from 6,600, came back down, and then a couple days later went to the summit at 8,163. So that's a like what is that? Like 1,600 meter difference. So that's really significant. That was not part of the plan. That's a whole other story, but we'll just say that wasn't part of the plan, and I wouldn't replicate that. I would rather go a little bit higher, closer to the altitude of the actual summit that I'll be going for. But I think I really only need one trip up that high. So doing one trip and then coming down and then making sure I give myself enough rest to get ready to do the record a few days later.
Okay. 14, all gear fully dialed, have backups, which I think, yes, that makes sense. I remember a long time
Yep.
ago when you did your first attempt at the fastest known time on Mount Aconcagua in
Mm.
Argentina, you had a little problem where your crampon fell apart.
Yeah, it sure
So
did.
is that so this is just like making sure everything is double
Yeah.
checked 3 times kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. And just figuring out, exactly what gear I'm going to use on the mountain and having it feel like a second skin. I think as I've gotten more into the mountain world, that's become really important is learning you just need more stuff and learning even little things like can I do my jacket zipper up with giant mittens on, things that you wouldn't think about until you're in those situations and having those kind of dress rehearsals. So yeah, I'm lucky enough right now where I have some brands that are working with me, even creating custom gear. So like FSP is this really cool backpack company, small business, and they're creating. We've been working together for like 6 months now to kind of prototype this little tiny summit bag, and I've used two different iterations of that and been sending them feedback. And so we're kind of working on the final version of that. And so like things like that, having that dialed is super comfortable. Everything is just the way that I want it so that when I'm on the mountain, I don't even have to think about gear. It's like everything is just second nature.
Yep. Okay. Makes a lot of sense and makes your father happier.
Yeah. Yep.
There is real danger on these mountains.
Yep.
Okay. 15, strike while the iron's hot. Don't wait for perfection.
Yeah, this was a reminder to myself because I think we kind of had the Goldilocks situation where, so if I look at the last two expeditions in the spring, Chris and I went to Lhotse and we didn't do this. We did the opposite. We were really waiting for everything to be perfect for both of us to go to the summit of Lhotse on the same day. And so we were waiting for both of us to be feeling really good, for the weather to be perfect, for the route not to be too crowded. All this stuff, we just waited and waited and waited. And then eventually, the day that we finally chose was pretty late in the season. We went up, we hit a bad snowstorm that we didn't expect to hit. We retreated, we came down. And then by the time we got down and we would have had time to recover, basically the season was over and we'd missed our shot. So on Manaslu, it was the opposite. So going Goldilocks, that was kind of one end. The other end on Manaslu, when I went to the summit, I wasn't even planning to go to the summit. It was earlier than I expected, but I just it was a training day. It turned into summit day. It turned into record day. And it was because I was just feeling good and I gave myself the opportunity to just go for it. And so I think that'll be the same thing on this project that I hope is, look for basically be ready as early as possible. And then a B plus day is fine. It doesn't have to be an A plus day with everything perfect. If you have a B plus day, but it's the opportunity is there and you feel good, just go for it. That's my reminder to myself. Because in the big mountains, like sometimes you only have one shot and you just have to take it regardless of whether it feels 100% perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Similar to your comment about you don't have to be fitter, you've got
Exactly.
enough. Yeah. Okay.
Like,
So that makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And then 16, which both your mother and your father don't like to really have to see as something that their son writes down as part of their avocation is don't die.
Yeah, I mean it's maybe a little bit tongue in cheek, but also it's true. It's I all this stuff is really important to me, and yet also I enjoy life. I want to remind myself to keep that in mind that at the end of the day this is sports, and I really care about it and I love it and it's exciting, but it's sports, and I'm very lucky that I get paid to exercise and go to the mountains and do cool stuff, and that there is risk. There's risk in all this stuff. There's risk in everything we do in life. I'm gonna get in a car and 15 minutes and go to the mountain. There's risk driving across the city. But at the same time, keeping that in the back of your head that, yeah, like people do die in these mountains and I don't want to die. And I want to take every precaution that I can to take care of myself and come back in one piece.
I'm glad to hear it.
You're
I
welcome.
very much
Thank
want you to come back in one
you.
piece,
I
record or
think,
no.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. 100%. So yeah, so that's my
Great.
list. Yeah, it's been, I think it's a good way to kind of introduce this, because yeah, this is stuff that I think about all the time and helps me think about how I structure my days and weeks, as well as even just making decisions on a day-to-day level. The don't get greedy one I think is maybe the most important. I guess I'll wrap it up by saying my good friend Jim Wamsley, who you've met, who's he's obviously, well, maybe not obviously to our listeners, but Jim is one of the best ultra marathon runners in the world. And he, I think, and I have similar personalities in that both in racing and training, sometimes our biggest enemy is ourselves. That we can kind of shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak, by trying too hard, putting too much ego into a race or into training. And I can't remember if it was him or his wife, Jess, but I remember seeing some interview with them. I think it was Jess was talking about it, and she was like, yeah, our goal for UTMB, which was the race he was in, was Jim, don't beat Jim. Like, don't lose to yourself. Don't don't beat yourself. Like, that's the way you're going to lose the race, is if you like kill yourself basically in the race. So I think
Yeah.
that's how I think about the don't get greedy stuff is, I can be my own worst enemy sometimes. And so I think as long as I don't like ruin it for myself, that's how I think about it is, okay, just don't don't ruin it for yourself. Don't beat yourself up. And don't get greedy. So
Yep.
that's where we'll leave it. Go back to number one is don't get greedy.
Wise advice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anytime I'm thinking like, oh, should I do this or should I do that? Should I push to the harder end of this workout or should I do the shorter end? Everything is going to come back to that. Is like, okay, which of these is the less greedy option? Which is the more conservative option? And
Mm-hmm.
go with that. Thank you all for listening again. As always, please send any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, anything you have. You can send those to me, Ty at Chosky.run. You can DM me, Tyler C. Andrews on Instagram. And remember, you can read my raw training logs on the blog at tylercandrews.com. You can get that delivered to your inbox as well via Substack at tylercandrews.substack.com. Thanks, guys, and we will talk to you next week. See ya.